Roman culture
Yeah,
obviously owed a lot to Greek culture, right? And I always
it did. Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
imagine, I
absolutely.
don't know if that's yeah, I don't know if that's accurate, but the ancient Greeks as maybe a little bit like the modern French, a stereotype, obviously, but as sort of epitomizing the high culture of the day, being super bougie, looking slightly down on what they perceive to be less sophisticated societies, even if some of those,
Yeah.
like the Romans, actually conquered them, right? So, do we perhaps know what the Greeks thought of this for them probably quite Ruffian activity?
The Greeks, well, we do know because they had a philosophy. So the Greeks' philosophy was arete. Arete is personal excellence in what you do. And it actually came to a sort of conflict with Roman philosophy, where the Romans believed in a philosophy which I think is a very important one. It's called virtus. Virtus is mental and physical strength and agility and endurance. And I think that virtus is, again, a very DNA, it's in our DNA because you see it in our culture. UFC fighting is virtus. It is the appreciation of physical and mental endurance. If you watch two guys in the championship of the UFC, even if the other guy gets beat, but he puts in, he takes the punches, he gets back up again, man, we really admire that. That's virtus. And I think it's funny because I would say in recent years, there's been a real attack on that aspect of culture, of society. Sorry, and the more we try and suppress it, the more we create it. Superheroes are virtus, like Hercules was to the Romans. He's a superhero. He's more than human, but he's there to remind us to go forward, to be better, to endure what life throws at you. And Arete and Virtus really came to a head because Arete, then what happens is when the Romans conquer the Greeks are no longer about war. So they become obsessed with personal excellence in sport. And the Romans hated it because they were all about these bodies. They were all about the physique, about being perfect. They weren't actually functional, but they wanted to look like the statues. Originally, the statues were made
Aesthetics.
because aesthetics. And I think that if you look at today's gym culture, you have the same problem. You have, like, if you go on Instagram, you've got all these perfect bodies, but they're not functional. They're great to look at, but they don't have any function behind them. And that's exactly what the Greeks and Romans had a problem with. The Romans are like, the Greeks are just, they're obsessed with their looks and their diets, and they're not really tough. They don't have the virtus that the Romans do.
Wow, that is what a superb analogy. So, like Greeks in contemporary terms, gym culture, Romans, UFC,
It's all there.
functionality
It's all
versus
there.
aesthetics.
Functionality versus aesthetics. Anyone who goes to the gym or who's becoming an old man like me and goes on Instagram and sees all these poses, and then you're like, you can't actually run. You look at these great bodybuilders, you can't run, you couldn't probably fight. And I feel very Roman when I do that. And I think, okay, well, that's what the Romans were experiencing. So, and I'm sure many people can relate to that.
Amen. Okay, slight pushback one last time on account of the ancient Greeks. So they did enjoy famously, of course, watching sports, including fighting, like pankration and wrestling, as part of the Olympic Games. So,
Yes.
so what would you say was the crucial difference then there between these sports and gladiatorial combat?
So gladiator sports so the Greeks call these the heavy sports. And gladiator sport is an extension of that. It's kind of like, okay, we can get two guys boxing each other. Great. Now, okay, let's go one further. What can we do? What about if they could wrestle each other? Okay. What about if they could punch and kick each other? Okay, then you got pankration. It's like, well, how do we go further? What if we added weapons? Okay, perfect. So really, it's an extension. But the mentality that the Greeks originally had towards their sports is inherited by gladiators, because majoritively gladiators didn't die, but there was always the risk of death. The gladiator did not walk into the arena thinking, "Oh, I'm going to avoid death completely." The gladiator walked in knowing that death might be waiting for them, but they took it with courage. They laughed at it. Anyone who did pankration, who wrestled, who boxed, faced the same mentality, because when you boxed, it wasn't in rounds. You went till you were incapacitated. Many of the injuries you
Oh
would
my
receive in
God.
boxing, in pankration, I mean, they were life-threatening, life-changing injuries. You know, you're talking about two
There
guys
were
going
no
at each other.
rounds, so somebody
There
had to
was no
get
rounds.
knocked
No,
out,
no,
at least.
no. You won. The only way the fight stopped was if you put one finger up, which is what the gladiators later. In fact, you see that there's elements of the sports that are then inherited into gladiator combat. So in gladiator combat, when you were done, you did the missio, you put a finger up. Which, by the way, I always think is so funny that if you go to modern sports stadiums, there's people with foam hands that have the same finger. You know the big foam finger in
Yeah,
in American sports
yeah, the
stadiums. Yeah,
glove.
yeah, and that symbol is a Roman and Greek symbol. So in boxing, you put your finger up if you're like, I'm, you know, maybe you got smashed in the face and you're like, no, that's me done, or you were incapacitated. That's when the round stopped, when the fight stopped. So there are no rounds. You imagine two guys, they've got leather or wood or metal in their gloves. They are clocking each other. In fact, there's a famous statue called the Boxer at Rest. It's a beautiful bronze statue in a museum in Rome. And you see the guy and he's kind of resting, and you can see his face is smashed, his nose is smashed, his ears are cauliflowered, his lips, you know, cut. And
Jesus.
you understand, yeah, in fact, there's a very famous inscription from Greece that says, a boxer's victory is earned in blood. So the violence of sport is definitely prevalent in Greek sports. Of course it is. But the difference between the Greeks and the Romans, and I always say that the Roman gladiator was the first modern sports superstar. And people always get upset. In fact, if you go on Instagram right now, you'll see there's a couple of videos of me saying it. And everyone's always like, what about the Olympics? The Olympics did not reach the reach that modern sports stars do today. If you look at modern sports stars, the reach they have, the wealth they have, the draw they have is unparalleled in history, unless you're talking about the Roman gladiator. The Olympians didn't come close to the fame or the scale or the wealth that the Roman gladiator did. So I'm not saying, obviously, the Olympians were the first sports star or first sportsmen, but the first sports superstars that are relatable to modern superstars are the Roman gladiator. They experience fame on a level. I mean, the Roman Empire is 60 million people. And if you are a good gladiator, you will be the draw. People don't go to the Olympics or never went to the Olympics to see a particular athlete. Romans would go to a match to see a gladiator. And we know this because there are posters in Pompeii that say, you know, come to the games. Fiamma will be appearing. You're like, oh my God. And if you go to a poster and it says, come to the UFC because Conor McGregor's fighting, you're like, oh yeah, definitely. I'm going to go to that. So that's the difference. The Greeks did not do it on the level the Romans did.
Thank you for listening. I really, really appreciate it. This podcast has no sponsors, no production team, and no editors. It's just little old me. And as such, I'm at the mercy of you lovely folks watching and listening. So please do subscribe on YouTube. Click that little bell thing or whatever. Follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Also, I don't want to sell you a stupid mug that you don't really need. So if you can, and most of all, if you want, please support me on Patreon. And here I have to express my eternal gratitude to my patrons on Patreon, aka the producers of this show. As always, without you, comrades, this show wouldn't exist. You better believe it. So massive thanks to Marin Ferrara, Aljaž, Strole, Aida, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Goran, Gordan, Lorenzo, Jurečuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Taichi. Absolute legends. Thanks again.